Something happened this week that is going to be talked about in foreign policy circles for years. The President of the United States, surrounded by the biggest energy crisis the world has seen in decades, made a unilateral decision to lift sanctions on Russia, not with the blessing of America's closest partners, not after consulting the alliance. He did it over the explicit objections of 6 out of 7 G7 nations: Canada, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, and Japan. And he did it while those same allies were standing on a frozen battlefield in the Arctic, watching NATO soldiers train to defend Europe against the exact country Trump just handed a financial lifeline. And the man who stared directly into the camera and said, "We will not follow," was Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney, speaking from northern Norway, 200 miles above the Arctic Circle, with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz standing to his left and Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Store standing to his right. Washington did not see that coming. And today, we are going to walk through every piece of this story: what happened, why it happened, what it means for you, and what it means for where America stands in the world right now. Let's start with the context, because without the context, this story doesn't fully land. We are currently living through what energy analysts are calling the biggest oil supply disruption in recorded history. At the end of February 2026, the United States and Israel launched military strikes against Iran. Tehran responded by closing down the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply flows every single day. That closure sent global oil prices through the roof. Brent crude surged past $100 a barrel. Gas prices in the United States began climbing again. Inflation fears returned. And the Trump administration, which had already been trying to manage the economic fallout of its own tariff wars, found itself staring at a political nightmare. High energy prices are politically toxic. Every administration knows this. And so the White House started looking for ways, any way, to bring those prices back down. One of those ways, it turned out, was Russia. Here is the thing you need to understand about Russia's so-called shadow fleet. After the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the United States and its allies built one of the most sophisticated sanctions regimes in modern history. They imposed a price cap on Russian oil. They sanctioned Russian tankers. They targeted Russia's largest oil companies, Lukoil, Rosneft by name. And it worked. By December of 2025, Russia's Urals crude was trading at under $40 a barrel, nearly $25 below the global benchmark. Russia's oil revenue, which funds somewhere between 20 and 30% of the Kremlin's entire federal budget, was bleeding out. Vladimir Putin's war machine in Ukraine was being strangled, slowly, by the combined economic pressure of the Western alliance. That was the state of play going into this year. Then the Iran war happened, and everything changed. Russian oil prices shot back up. They are now trading above $80 a barrel, still discounted, but dramatically higher than before. And suddenly, Russia's shadow fleet, those aging, obscure tankers registered in countries that weren't enforcing the sanctions, carrying oil through back channels and workarounds, became attractive again to buyers desperate for supply. Countries like Thailand, which imports half its oil from the Persian Gulf, started calling Moscow. Japan, which imported 94% of its oil from the Middle East last year, started making the same calculations. The Kremlin saw its opportunity and seized it. And on Thursday, March 12th, 2026, the Trump administration gave the Kremlin exactly what it had been waiting for. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced on X, not in a formal press briefing, not after a congressional notification, but on X, that the United States would issue a 30-day waiver on sanctions against Russian oil shipments that had already been loaded onto tankers as of that day. Any buyer, anywhere in the world, could now purchase that oil without fear of violating U.S. sanctions law. Bessent framed it as a narrow, short-term measure. He said, and this is a direct quote from his post, that the move was designed to promote stability in global energy markets and would not provide significant financial benefit to the Russian government. That last line, specifically, is where every expert, every European ally, and every Democratic lawmaker immediately pushed back, because the numbers tell a very different story. Russia's daily oil and gas export income had already increased significantly since the Iran war began. With this waiver now in place, every tanker already at sea, dozens of vessels carrying Russian crude, could now be sold at full market price without penalty. The Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air has been tracking Russia's export revenue in real time, and what they found is unambiguous. Russia was already profiting from the chaos. This waiver made it substantially worse. And here is the detail that truly made Washington lawmakers' jaws drop. This announcement came just one day after Russian envoy Kirill Dmitriev, head of Putin's Sovereign Wealth Fund, had met in Florida with White House Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. One day, the optics of that timing were, at minimum, deeply troubling to anyone paying attention. Now let's talk about what was happening in Europe at that exact same moment, because the timing is almost cinematic. While the Trump administration was finalizing this sanctions waiver in Washington, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney had flown to northern Norway to witness NATO's cold response exercise, the largest military exercise of its kind in the world, involving more than 30,000 soldiers, sailors, and aircrew from across the alliance. Germany's Friedrich Merz was there. Norway's Jonas Gahr Store was there. They were watching tens of thousands of NATO troops drill for the scenario everyone in European defense circles is now treating as a genuine possibility: a Russian military incursion into Scandinavia, into the Baltics, into NATO territory. The exercise included scenarios specifically modeled on Russian forces attempting to seize key Norwegian islands in what military planners call low-risk, probing operations designed to test whether NATO will actually invoke its Article 5 Mutual Defense Clause. These weren't hypothetical war games based on old Cold War thinking. These were drills built around current Russian military doctrine. And in the middle of all of that, the tanks, the fighter jets, the special forces skiing through the snow, the news broke that Trump had just lifted sanctions on Russia. Carney, Merz, and Store found out essentially in real time. And here is where the story gets personal, because according to reporting from CBC News, all three leaders were genuinely caught off guard. This wasn't a decision they had been warned about. It wasn't something the White House had telegraphed to its allies. It happened, and then they found out about it through the news. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz was the bluntest about what that felt like. He told reporters directly that in the G7 virtual call held just 2 days earlier, on Wednesday, the leaders had discussed this exact question, and 6 of the 7 members, according to Merz, clearly were of the opinion that we should not release the sanctions against Russia. 6 out of 7, and Trump did it anyway. If you were standing in Norway, watching NATO's largest military exercise, having just argued in a conference call that releasing Russia's sanctions was the wrong move, and you wake up the next morning to find out Trump did it anyway, you have a choice to make. Do you stay quiet? Do you make diplomatic noises and hope it goes away? Or do you stand in front of the cameras and say what you actually believe? Mark Carney chose option 3. And what he said, standing in the Arctic cold, flanked by 2 of Europe's most powerful leaders, landed in Washington like a thunderclap. Canada's position is to maintain sanctions on Russia, Carney said. Maintain sanctions, including on the Shadow Fleet, which is moving this oil. There has been very tight cooperation between Russia and Iran at great cost to the people of Ukraine and a great threat to peace and security in Europe. That was not diplomatic language. That was a direct public rebuttal of American foreign policy, delivered from a NATO military exercise in front of the world. And it was only the beginning. If you have been following this channel and you want to go even deeper on how the Western alliance has been fracturing in real time, right now would be a great time to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because this story is not over, and we are going to be covering every development as it happens. Now, Norwegian Prime Minister Store added his own voice. He said there needs to be more pressure on Russia, not less. And Merz announced that he would be speaking to French President Emmanuel Macron over the weekend to discuss what the European G7 members could do collectively in response. Meanwhile, in Paris, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who happened to be meeting with Macron on that same Friday, looked into the cameras and said something that cut through all the diplomatic language. He said he believed that lifting sanctions would, in any case, lead to a strengthening of Russia's position. Zelensky has been watching the Kremlin's war machine for 4 years now. He knows what Russian oil revenue buys. It buys missiles. It buys drones. It buys the artillery shells that are landing on Ukrainian cities every single day. And the Trump administration just handed Vladimir Putin a 30-day reprieve from the financial pressure that had been working, that had been slowly forcing the Kremlin to the table. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was equally unequivocal. She had been on the G7 call Wednesday. She had heard the arguments. And after the announcement, she came out and said the paralysis of the Strait of Hormuz in no way justifies lifting sanctions on Russia. French President Emmanuel Macron added his own response, saying that the U.S. decision to soften these sanctions would not lead to their cancellation on the European side. France was staying put. Macron also made clear he was deeply concerned. The European position was unified, and it was directly, publicly contradicting Washington. Here in the United States, the backlash on Capitol Hill was also immediate and fierce. Representative Sam Liccardo of California and Senator Ruben Gallego of Arizona released a letter that contained one of the most striking lines I have read in recent American political commentary. They wrote, "Even more troubling than the rise of oil prices is the lifeline the United States has given to Russia, just as U.S. officials confirmed Russia is providing Iranian forces with the locations of American military assets, including warships and aircraft. By providing this waiver, you have signaled that the United States will reward attacks on our troops, not deter them." Read that again slowly. U.S. officials have confirmed Russia is providing Iran with the locations of American military assets, while American sailors and airmen are in harm's way in the Middle East right now. And the response from this administration was to ease sanctions on Russian oil. That is not a partisan talking point. That is a factual sequence of events described by members of both parties in official communications. And it should disturb every single American regardless of where they stand politically. Defense One, one of the most respected national security publications in Washington, ran an analysis this week with a headline that deserves to be read out loud. Why the narrow, short-term sanctions reversal for Russia is neither. Their reporting pointed to something that rarely gets discussed in the mainstream political conversation: the institutional decay of America's sanctions enforcement infrastructure. Within weeks of taking office in early 2025, the Trump administration disbanded the Biden-era task force that was specifically dedicated to enforcing sanctions against Russia's shadow fleet. Then the administration froze federal hiring, including at the Treasury offices responsible for monitoring those sanctions. By last April, Senate Democrats had documented that the enforcement team had become unable to keep pace with attrition. Experienced staff left. They weren't replaced. And Russia's shadow fleet operators, many of them running vessels through China and other third countries, kept right on working while America's watchdogs were being dismantled from the inside. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who served in the first Trump administration, put it plainly. Sanctions, he wrote, are hard to put back on once taken off. And now, 3 days after that waiver was issued, we are watching the downstream effects in real time. Thailand has already announced it would begin talking to Moscow about buying Russian oil. Japan said it would consider purchasing Russian crude. The Kremlin, for its part, wasted absolutely no time. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov welcomed the U.S. move, and then had the audacity to say it still wasn't enough. Peskov told reporters that there is no way for the market to stabilize without significant volumes of Russian oil. That is the Kremlin telling Washington that the concession was good. Now keep them coming. That is not the response of an adversary feeling pressure. That is an adversary who has just been told the pressure is lifting. Meanwhile, back in Norway, on Sunday, March 15th, one day before we are broadcasting this story to you, Mark Carney attended a mini-summit in Oslo, a gathering of the 5 Nordic nations plus Canada, specifically focused on Arctic security. And what happened at that summit added another extraordinary layer to this week's events. Danish media asked Carney directly whether Canada would commit troops to defend Greenland against threats of U.S. annexation by the Trump administration. This is not a hypothetical question. Trump has spent months making explicit threats about seizing Greenland, a territory of America's NATO ally, Denmark. And Carney's answer was unambiguous. We stand foursquare behind the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, he said. It is for the people of Greenland and Denmark to decide their futures. We will back that with measures as necessary. Canada is now publicly signaling it will take concrete action if the United States moves militarily on NATO-allied territory. That is the world we are living in as of this week. Icelandic Prime Minister Kristrún Hjálfradóttir said something at that Oslo summit that crystallized the mood among America's northern allies. She said, "Iceland has felt the pressure and felt the sort of shift in action around us. We've been worried about Greenland. We're worried in general about the situation in Europe when it comes to Ukraine. But we are not afraid." Norway's Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre echoed that sentiment, emphasizing that the Nordic nations and Canada together stand for human rights and the sanctity of international norms. These are small countries with long memories of what happens when great powers start rewriting the rules of international order. And right now, they are not blinking. Let me step back for a moment, because I want to make sure we're not losing the forest for the trees here. What we are watching is not just a policy disagreement about oil sanctions. It is something much deeper and much more consequential. Since the beginning of this year, we have seen the following. Trump threatened to annex Greenland, a territory of NATO ally Denmark. He imposed tariffs on 8 NATO allies for the audacity of participating in joint military exercises on that very island. He sent a letter to the Norwegian Prime Minister, a letter that has since been widely described by senators from both parties as unhinged, threatening to pursue Greenland by force after claiming Norway was responsible for him not winning the Nobel Peace Prize. He overrode 6 of the 7 G7 nations on a question of Russia sanctions during an active war in Ukraine. And he is doing all of this while Russia is reportedly feeding Iran the locations of American military assets. The Council on Foreign Relations China specialist David Sachs perhaps said it most bluntly. Trump is doing China's work for it. Beijing, Sachs said, can't believe its luck. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech at Davos in January, where he received a standing ovation from the assembled world leaders, reverberated because it named what was happening without flinching. Carney warned that hegemons cannot continually monetize their relationships. That phrase, coming from a former central banker who understands economic power dynamics at a structural level, was not rhetoric. It was a diagnosis. And what we saw play out in Norway this week, Carney and 2 other NATO leaders publicly rebuking the American president from a NATO military exercise, is that diagnosis becoming reality in front of our eyes. There are people in Washington who will tell you this is all temporary. They will say Trump is negotiating. They will say the sanctions waiver is just 30 days. They will say the alliances are resilient. And maybe they are right. But here is what the historical record shows. Once sanctions come off, they are extraordinarily difficult to put back on. Once allies learn they cannot rely on Washington's word in a conference call, they start making other arrangements. And they are already doing exactly that. Canada's Prime Minister has been to China. Britain's Prime Minister has been to China. Germany's Chancellor went to China in February. France, Ireland, South Korea, Finland, all sending their leaders to Beijing this year, after years of conspicuously avoiding it. The European Union has struck major trade deals with South America and India. Canada has announced it will prioritize domestic arms purchases and reduce its reliance on U.S. military suppliers. These are not symbolic gestures. These are structural shifts in the architecture of the Western alliance, happening in real time, right now, in 2026. And here on the home front, American voters are feeling the consequences too. Gas prices are high. Inflation is ticking back up. The Iran war, which the administration launched, is the proximate cause of the biggest energy shock in history, according to the International Energy Agency. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is being tapped, 172 million barrels released this week alone, as part of a 400 million barrel coordinated release by the 32-nation IA. And even with all of that, Brent crude is still trading above $100 a barrel. The administration's answer to this problem was to give Russia a lifeline. 6 of its closest allies said that was the wrong call. Ukraine's president said it will strengthen Russia. National security experts said it rewards Russian behavior that is actively endangering American troops. And the markets have barely moved. Oil prices eased slightly on Friday morning after the announcement, but remain near historic highs. The waiver is a band-aid on a wound that is still bleeding. So where does this leave us? Here is what we know as of today, Monday, March 16th, 2026. The sanctions waiver is in effect for 30 days. Carney, Merz, and the other allied leaders have said they will use their direct lines to the White House to try to reverse the decision. Whether those conversations have any effect remains to be seen. The Nordic-Canada Summit in Oslo produced a unified statement of support for sovereignty, Arctic security, and continued pressure on Russia, a statement conspicuously at odds with current U.S. policy. Ukraine's president is in Paris, coordinating with France. European defense ministers are calling each other over the weekend, and Vladimir Putin, sitting in Moscow, watching all of this, has every reason to feel that the pressure which was slowly squeezing his war economy has just been given a 30-day reprieve, with the possibility of more to come. I want to close with something that I think deserves to be said plainly. The men and women of the United States military are in the Middle East right now. They are in harm's way. They are in a conflict zone where, according to official U.S. reporting, Russia is actively helping Iran target American assets. And this week, their own government eased economic pressure on the country that is helping aim the crosshairs. That is not a political statement. It is a statement of what the factual record shows. The people who are serving this country deserve a foreign policy that protects them. The allies who have stood with America through every crisis of the last 80 years deserve to be heard when 6 of them say unanimously, this is the wrong call. And the American people deserve to know exactly what is being done in their name and why. This story is not over. The next 30 days will tell us a great deal about whether this waiver is truly temporary or whether it is the beginning of something much larger. We will be watching every development and reporting it back to you as it happens. If you found this breakdown valuable, please share it with someone who needs to understand what is happening right now in American foreign policy, because these decisions are going to have consequences that outlast any news cycle. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay engaged, and we will see you in the next one.